All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. Apologies if there was false advertising that there would be some sort of lunch at the office. I've been working remotely for so long that I forgot that like a lunch and learn could be a physical thing where people give you food in exchange for listening to what they say. So sorry if you thought there was going to be food at the office, but hopefully this is still entertaining. So thanks for coming. This is Panvala. So to kick things off, what is Panvala? So Panvala is an incentivized DAO that funds the Ethereum ecosystem. And what we mean by incentivized DAO is that instead of just taking an ether and having equal voting rights over the ether, the way that most DAOs work, there's actually an incentive to grow Panvala. Because instead of taking an ether and spending out that ether, Panvala runs on its own token. So we issue grants in our own token and we take in donations in our own token. And the idea is that if you increase the flow of donations coming into the system, you're increasing the demand of the token that you hold. So when you start participating in Panvala, you have an incentive to grow Panvala and get more work funded rather than just participating on an equal basis with everybody who is who's also contributed to the system. So that's what it makes it an incentivized DAO. So we think that this sort of thing is particularly important for Ethereum because we have such a compelling vision of what Ethereum is and what it can do for the world, but there aren't really reliable business models for a lot of the work that needs to be done. I believe that a lot of that vision is going to have to be implemented as a public good. So instead of people building businesses around a lot of this infrastructure, some of it's going to be stuff that's built and doesn't have any ability to extract value for the people who created it. So if we're going to fund this work as a public good, we need some way to find the people who are actually going to fund it. And Panvala is basically an incentive system to find the people who are going to fund the work that makes the Ethereum vision actually get fulfilled. So again, when you increase donations to the system, that increases demand for the token that the participants hold. So that's why it's worth doing that hard work to identify the best work that should receive grants and to build a culture of generosity that brings that flow of donations into the system. So the first question that we get about Panvala very often is why use a token? Why not just run on Ether? And the reason that we do that is because tokens allow our community to fund work with both money and with power. And the most useful way to think about this is if you imagine that our community already has a flow of $10,000 a month that we've managed to raise somehow, either through individual donations, corporate donations, some other way. The traditional way to deploy that money is just giving that money directly to the people doing work. So $10,000 comes in as donations and $10,000 goes out to the grant recipients. They pay their bills and they're happy. But if instead you use a token to reward the work, then those those people doing the work now hold these tokens, and some of them need to pay their bills today, so they're going to sell those tokens. They're going to sell those tokens into that flow of $10,000 a month. So those people, the people who are selling their tokens, get that $10,000 a month. They go pay their bills. But there's other people who receive tokens as grants who, instead of selling them, they decide that they don't need money urgently to pay their bills. Instead, they would prefer to have voting power over the future budget of the system. So they hold on to those tokens and they vote in the system on an ongoing basis. So you started off with $10,000 a month to fund work, but once you used a token to mediate the community's cooperation, you still had that $10,000 a month, but now you had something else. It's a question mark. We don't know how much people value having power over the voting, over the budget and a system, but it's something. The idea is that money alone is less than money plus power. If you can reward people in money and power over the community's decisions, then you can make more people happy for doing work for your community. So one way to think about this is to compare it to a central bank. So pretty much every country out there has a central bank, or at least wants to have a central bank. Some countries can't effectively operate them, but everybody wants to do it. And the reason that they do it is because it's a no-brainer. If you have an effective central bank, you can fund the work with both the money that you raise from taxes, but additionally with the power to force your citizens to hold on to that currency that your central bank created. And when your citizens hold on to that currency, it makes it a lot easier for you to borrow money and increase what you can spend. So nations typically fund work not just with the money from taxes, but with the power to get their citizens to hold the currency that represents their debt. It's a no-brainer. Everybody wants to do it. So similarly, I think that every community that's trying to engage in some sort of voluntary cooperation will fund their work with their own token. It's a no-brainer. Instead of just funding the work with the money that you raise from donations, you can fund work with both that money and power over the future spending decisions of your community. So again, I think the same way that almost every nation has a central bank that they use to fund their work, I think every community will have a token that they use to fund their work, because money alone is less than money plus power. So for people who've been around the different communities in cryptocurrency for a while, I think it's pretty clear that each token produces a culture that its community reinforces in order to maintain the narrative behind the token itself. So the most clear example of this is Bitcoin. It was a little bit after the financial crisis, people were kind of skeptical, people were getting bailed out, losses were being socialized, but gains were being privatized. And this system that couldn't be corrupted was launched for the world to see. And the culture that built up around that was based on those values. It was an idea that we should resist change because that can be politically influenced, and just wait for mass adoption to happen. You want to hold. And that mass adoption is inevitable because Austrian economics says that this is a better type of currency that will eventually take over the world. That's the culture that gets built up there. It's a very interesting culture. I learned a lot from that culture. I wouldn't say that it's my primary culture that I participate in right now, but it's very distinct and pretty educational. Ethereum built up a different kind of culture. So it still has its own currency with a limited supply. But the culture that built up around it was based on the technology itself. The thing that was new about it was that you could build things on top of it. It wasn't just a currency you could hold, it was a thing you can build on top of. So the culture that built up around it was that you should build something useful on top. And instead of just joining the community as someone holding a token, if you have the skills to contribute to what's happening, the culture is one that actively encourages you to do that. You should build. We pitched this vision of Ethereum as the world's open financial system, but the only way that that vision can be fulfilled is if people actually build on top of it. So we reinforce that culture over and over to maintain the narrative behind the token. Nobody has to command us to do that. If you hold Ether and you see what other people in your community are doing, as long as it makes sense to you that that makes the vision, the narrative behind the token more likely, you just do it organically, and it's pretty magical. This to me has been one of the most fascinating communities that I've been a part of. And I think having a culture of building is a much better culture than one of just holding on to something. So with Panvala, when we create our own token to run this system, again, we need to consider what culture can actually reinforce the narrative behind the token itself. Since it's a system that issues grants in its own currency and takes in donations in its own currency, what culture needs to exist to reinforce that? What culture is the community going to want to reinforce to make that happen? So what I'm currently workshopping is, instead of hodl and buildle, instead it's a bundle. So it's a culture where people are actively raising funds to support the work that our community depends on. So the Ethereum vision is extremely compelling, but it's a vision that just won't fund itself. It's a vision that's worth sacrificing for. So if you build a culture where that happens, that's the most likely way to make the Ethereum vision actually be fulfilled. So I think that if this, the more this token takes hold within our community, the more the culture of our community will basically warp itself to maintain the narrative around the token. People will want there to be more demand for the token that they hold, so they'll go out there they'll raise funds from the community, they'll get people to donate. And as a result, they'll fund the work that the vision actually requires. So that's the thesis behind this thing. The mission statement behind Panvala is to empower the world's people and economies to solve hard problems and reward their greatest social good. Panvala's ecosystem helps communities thrive by creating cultures of generosity through new methods of cooperation. So a lot of what I've said so far is really specific to the Ethereum community and how we can help the Ethereum community cooperate and fund the Ethereum community's vision. But that's not just what Panvala is about. That's where Panvala starts. We help the Ethereum vision fulfill its vision. We teach the Ethereum community how to cooperate in this new way. And when we succeed, we teach other communities how to operate in this way. And some people will do it by cloning Panvala and using their own token. But we think that Panvala itself can host many communities who work together to reward their greatest social good. So that's what we want to do with this system. If you're interested in this idea of tokens that create their own cultures, there's two videos that I think you should really watch. The first one is a talk that I gave, so maybe I'm tooting my own horn, but it's the Panvala launch speech that I gave at DAppCon in Berlin in August. It talks a little bit about this process of creating a culture. And Mark Balin gave a talk at DevCon in Osaka about how these tokens can create their own cultures. Both of these, I think, are really good talks that you should watch if you're interested in how tokens create their own cultures. So the Pan token itself is a token that we created from scratch. It's a normal ERC20 token. The way Panvala works is that we issue grants in Pan up to a maximum supply of 100 million Pan. And the idea is that we don't want to run out of those tokens. It's donations that sustain Panvala over the long run. So this chart right here is basically the first decade of Panvala. And during that period, there are basically 3 different phases. The first one was basically 2019, where most of the year we weren't launched. So we were distributing grants manually. We were still operating the system. We've been operating it since the beginning of the year. The first grants were given out on February 1st. So that's that part of the supply curve. We launched in August, and now we're in the vesting period where there's tokens for the launch team, for consensus, and for early grantees who commit to contribute over the long run. We call those people launch partners. Those tokens vest for 2 years. And then after that, it's just the tokens being issued as grants. So during the vesting period, there's still tokens being issued as grants as well. So that curve is the vesting tokens plus the grant tokens. And then beyond is just the grant tokens being released up to 100 million. So that's the first decade. Thinking beyond that, it's really, when we start to approach the 100 million token supply, it's not accurate to think of it as Bitcoin, where it's just like, hey, there's a supply that's definitely going to be hit, because unlike Bitcoin, there's tokens coming back into the token supply as donations. So in the long run, it's really the flow of donations that's putting downward pressure on the circulating supply. So the price of the token will fluctuate, the flow of donations in US dollars will fluctuate. So there's the supply itself will, if it reaches equilibrium, will fluctuate based on the donations coming in. The graph in this particular model is one that reaches equilibrium around a supply of 95 million tokens. And at that supply, the budget of Panvala, according to the curve, is about 1 million Pan per year. So if this is the model that plays out, there would be 1 million Pan on an ongoing basis to reward as grants, but the US dollar value of that budget depends on the US dollar value of the donations coming in. Because once we reach equilibrium, it's dollars in equals dollars out. There's no magic here. It's just you organize a community, you reach equilibrium, and dollars in is dollars out. So if you never do that work to build a culture of generosity, to build a flow of donations, then you just kind of spend all the tokens, and maybe you have something like Bitcoin where people still hold it anyway, but that's not really the culture we're trying to build here. We're trying to build a culture where the people who organize around the system are the people who are actually trying to make donations happen because they have a goal that they want to achieve together. They're not just here for speculation. They're here to fulfill a vision. So far, Panvala has funded about 30 different teams in the Ethereum ecosystem. A big part of our focus has been on Ethereum 2.0. So you'll see client teams like Sigma Prime, Prismatic Labs, the Nimbus team at Status. There's also Whiteblock, who doesn't work on a particular client, but they build tools that all the teams can use to improve their work. There's layer 2 scaling projects like Connext, Plasma Group, counterfactual state channels, all that kind of stuff has received grants from Panvala. There's security work from teams like Runtime Verification. Gnosis received a grant for their work on the Gnosis Safe. And Ethers.js, a very popular developer library in the ecosystem, has received a grant as well. Beyond those teams, there's also teams within Consensus that have received grants for the work that they do. So the Bounties Network and Gitcoin have received grants that they can use to basically distribute their own bounties and grants further within the ecosystem. Pegasus received a grant for their work on Ethereum 2.0, and Consensus Diligence received a grant for their work on an audit of the Viper compiler. So if you're not familiar with Viper, it's basically like Solidity, but it's another language that runs on Ethereum, and these compilers have to be audited to make sure that that the contracts written in them do what they're supposed to do. So when people get grants from the system, some of the recipients sell their PAN. So we've been operating on the mainnet since August, and during that time, Tenderly is one of the grant recipients who sold their tokens. So when we talked to them, they said that they held their PAN as long as they could, and when they got to the point when they were running out of funds for their work, they sold the 200,000 PAN that they got in their grant, and they got 27 Ether in exchange. And with that money, they were able to extend their runway by about a month. So that to us is a particularly good sign. Like, it's very early on in Panvala's system, and it's already able to provide people more time, more runway to do the work that they're trying to do to improve the Ethereum ecosystem. And if we can do that today, if we grow the system, we can probably make an even bigger impact. Some of the grantees also hold their PAN. So Gnosis is one of the teams that are holding on to their PAN, and they want to have voting power over the grants that we issue on an ongoing basis. So if you've heard of the Gecko, Gnosis's ecosystem fund, they already do a lot of work to try to get people to build on top of the Gnosis platform. And a lot of the work that they fund through that program improves the whole Ethereum ecosystem in general. It's not just about Gnosis. So if instead of working completely independently and funding their own work as a separate thing, they can basically offload some of that work to the whole community by cooperating with Panvala. So they can use their voting power to achieve some of their goals with Gecko, but instead of being entirely independent, they can work with the whole community to make that happen. So they're holding on to their PAN so they can do that. Panvala's governance should be a little bit familiar. It's modeled on the governance of Ethereum itself. So in Ethereum, the core devs make recommendations about what should go into the next fork. The client teams implement those recommendations, and then the miners decide whether or not to actually run that code. They accept or reject the recommendations of the core devs. And in Panvala, the astrotrope is Panvala's version of the core devs. And what the astrotrope does is they take in grant applications and make a recommendation each quarter of which grant should be approved. Once that recommendation goes on chain, the network can either accept those recommendations or they can challenge them with their own recommendations. And when there's a challenge, that initiates a token vote. So whichever recommendation gets the most votes is the one that gets executed that quarter. So you can join the astrotrope, you can be a member of it. All you need to do is have PAN tokens and have a willingness to cooperate to produce unified recommendations for what Panvala should do each quarter. So each quarter we take in applications, and then if you're a member of the astrotrope, you help participate in that initial review of the applications before a recommendation goes out. The whole public participates in the review of the recommendation when it's still in a draft phase. But if you're a member of the astrotrope, you review basically all the applications, not just the recommendation. So this week, we're running a poll of the Ethereum community using Panvala's tokens. So the way this poll works is that you set what you think the breakdown per category should be of the work that gets funded in the Ethereum ecosystem. So if you think Ethereum 2.0 is really important, you increase the percentage for that category. If you think it's really dApps and usability that need to be focused on, you increase the percentage for that category and you cast your vote. And each ballot is weighted by the amount of PAN tokens held in that account. So the results of that poll are going to be used to allocate the next batch of grants. So when the Astrotrope makes its recommendation for the next quarter, we're going to say, hey, this is what the token holders wanted. This is what our recommendation is. Hopefully those are in sync. So the grant applications for the next batch close on Friday, and the poll that we're running closes on Friday as well. You can go vote at panvala.com/poll. So the most interesting thing to me about the way this poll works is that think about the flow of the PAN tokens that's going on during this vote. All of the PAN tokens that we issued are going to grant recipients. So they're going to people who did work that the whole Ethereum ecosystem depends on. So if you want to participate in this vote, if you want your voice to have more weight, the way your voice gets more weight is by swapping out some of your Ether for some PAN. And when you swap out some of your Ether for some PAN, it gets a lot easier for the grant recipients to swap out their PAN for some Ether. So you are helping to make it easier for those grant recipients to do that swap when you become a voter in Panvala. When you think about it, in Panvala, the people who are voting on each decision that gets made are the teams that are doing the work that everybody depends on, and also the individuals, the companies, etc., who are buying those tokens and holding on to them so they can have a vote in the system. So you're either doing that work directly or you gave Ether to somebody who did that work. Those are the people who vote in Panvala. And together we can build a flow of donations to fund work on an ongoing basis. So it's not just the tokens coming out that were pre-allocated, but if we do the work, we can build a culture of generosity that we together have voting power to influence. So very quickly, if you want to get started in Panvala as soon as possible, it's very simple. If you want to be a voter, you go vote in that poll, panvala.com/poll. Each quarter, we're going to hold a poll on the priorities for the community, and you need to hold PAN tokens to have voting weight in that poll. You can also join the forum to participate in discussions if you have ideas of things that should receive grants, if you have ideas of different ways that the system should work, etc. The forum is where those discussions happen. Make sure you cast your vote by Friday when voting in this poll closes. Another way to participate is as a grantee. So if your team does work that the whole Ethereum community benefits from, you're the prime candidate for a Panvala grant. And we want to make sure that we get those tokens in your hands. So if you're doing work that the community benefits from, send an email to the Astrotrope and we'll help you get started. You don't need a lot to start with in that email, literally just one sentence saying, hey, this is the kind of work that we're doing. Can we get a grant? And then we'll help you complete the process. So if you apply for those grants by Friday, that's when the application deadline is for this quarter. If you miss that deadline, we do grants every quarter, so you'll be in line for the next quarter. Another way to participate is as a donor. So we already talked about how voters buy tokens from grant recipients and hold on to them to vote. But if instead of holding on to tokens, you want to support Panvala in the long run to make Panvala sustainable, when you buy your tokens, you donate them back into Panvala's token supply. So that's the dynamic that makes Panvala sustainable in the long run. So if you want to help make Panvala sustainable, you go to panvala.com/donate, you donate some tokens, and you help keep the system going over the long run. If you're a company instead of an individual, you can be a Panvala sponsor. So sponsors are corporate donors, and they take their marketing budget and spend it on supporting the work that the Ethereum community benefits from. So when you do that, when you're funding Ethereum 2.0 instead of funding some ad in Times Square, you start to earn the loyalty from the Ethereum community. And if that's your customer base, that's extremely valuable for you. Right now, DAOs are one of the most fascinating stories happening in our industry. And when you sponsor Panvala, that makes your company a part of that story. So when people are publishing articles about what's happening in DAOs, your company will literally be what's happening in DAOs. So we help raise your profile and you help fund the work that the Ethereum community depends on. Another way to participate is as a fundraiser. So what fundraisers do is they raise funds for Panvala within their own social network. So you get a page on the Panvala site with a unique URL, and when donations come through that page, your name gets higher on the leaderboard of Panvala fundraisers. So actively fundraising raises your profile in the Ethereum community, but more importantly, when you apply for a grant, Panvala prioritizes grant applications from active fundraisers. So if you think that you have future work that's a public good for the Ethereum ecosystem, becoming a fundraiser is a good way to make sure that when you're ready, those tokens for grants are basically waiting for you. So this is something that we're designing right now. And if you want to shape what we build, you can be involved in the design process. So shoot us an email. And if you're interested in being a fundraiser, we would love your input in how that gets designed. And lastly, you can participate in Panvala as a member of the Astrotrope. So again, the Astrotrope is Ethereum's version of the core devs. And if you have Pan tokens and a willingness to cooperate to produce a recommendation together, you can help review those grant applications and have more input into those recommendations when they're in an early phase. But again, the whole community gets to have input into the draft recommendation before it's finalized. But when you're in the Astrotrope, you see all the grant applications, not just what goes out in that initial recommendation. So you can join today, send an email to the Astrotrope, and we'll help get you involved. So again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to hear me talk about Panvala. Right now, we have this new model for cooperation that we think is a no-brainer. I believe that every community that's trying to organize voluntary cooperation is going to run on something like Panvala. But before that can happen, some people have to prove that it works. And that's what we spend our time doing every day. But what really needs to happen for that is for people to participate in the system. So your participation early on in Panvala's history is what determines whether this system works, whether we get to show the world a new way of cooperating, or whether it doesn't, and whether we go off and do something else. So we really appreciate your support. We appreciate your participation. And if you have any questions, we have, I think, plenty of time for that. So thanks again for coming, and looking forward to some questions.
I have a quick question. Just as far as you said, the Panvala's been operating since this year. What are like some of the big lessons that you feel like the team has learned, kind of over the last what month is it? November, 11 months.
So that's a good question. We found that when you're trying to organize a community that's trying to cooperate like this, the most effective thing is to be face-to-face in person at conferences, and not just being at the conferences, but actually having a booth at the conference where people are coming to you trying to figure out what you do, and you basically have a hook to get them involved. At ETH New York, we had, I think, 70 people pledged to become part of Panvala. At DAppCon in Berlin, I think we had about 50 people. It's been really effective to be there in person with a booth and get people on board. We've also found that when it comes to getting grant applications in the door, it's a very heavy manual process of outreach, especially when you're giving out effectively fake money. People tell me not to refer to Pan tokens as fake money because it's misleading, but it's tokens that may or may not have value. When we're trying to give out grants in these tokens that may or may not have value, it takes a lot more work to convince people that they should take the time out of their day to get those tokens. But we've done a lot of work, and a lot of people have gotten those grants. So we're excited about where things are at now. Now that the tokens actually do have a US dollar value, it's a lot easier to explain to people like, hey, we in the next quarter, we have 2 million Pan to allocate as grants. Based on the current market price, that's worth about $25,000. So we basically are giving out grants of $25,000. That's a lot easier of a pitch than it was earlier this year. So there's definitely been a lot of learning experiences. The most fascinating learning experience was actually before I started working on Panvala, what is now Panvala. but when it was just an idea. So that was at the consensus retreat in February of last year. I had the rough form of this idea, but I was like, how do I prove that this is actually something worth working on? So I created a game version of Panvala that was basically just poker chips and in-person meetings about what to issue grants for. So we played that game at the consensus retreat in Portugal in 2018, and that's what really made it clear to me that this idea had some legs, that it's something that could actually be sustainable, that could actually get people excited to participate. And now I'm trying to replicate that, but instead of just within consensus, creating a game that the whole world plays together, and hopefully it works.
That's really interesting. When you say like you play, I love the idea of like creating a game and like testing out token economics via games. When you say like you created a game, and you know it was interesting. Like, was it just like the amount of participation that you saw, or was it like what was the specific lift or like improvement in the process that you saw whenever you were just prototyping it out?
So there were some governance theories in that game that proved that it became clear that they would not work from that game. So that was really interesting.
Awesome. I'm like a product designer, so I'm all about prototyping and learning things as early and as cheaply as possible. So that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing was like when I was explaining the game to people and they wanted tokens, like I made them buy the tokens from me to kind of, because that's what they would have to do in real life. So I was like, well, you got to buy the tokens from me. And they were like, so what are you going to do with that money? Are you going to like spend it on something that benefits all of us? I was like, no, I'm going to go buy Lambos with that money. Like, I'm selling you tokens, like just buy. And then they still bought. So like that to me was interesting. But like, that was the actual dynamic that we were trying to test. So I couldn't just say like if I were to just say, oh, I'm gonna buy everybody lunch, like that's not what I was trying to test. So that would have made it not as good. So
right, you're trying to test out whether or not the active participation was worth a value to those participants. That's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. If you ever have any questions about anything involved in Panvala, please DM me, talk to anybody on the team. We love hearing from people. We love getting feedback from people. If there's anything you think we're doing that is suboptimal, we definitely want to know. And again, like your participation is what determines whether or not this thing works. And the potential of an idea is not all it takes. It takes people actually using the thing and showing people that it works. So if this thing does the thing that I expect it to do, being one of those people who actually participated early on, I think is going to be a really cool thing to be able to talk about. It's going to be a fun story. So looking forward to seeing the role that you play in that story. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.